So last time I explained to you that Bhagavad-Gita contains all the Ashtikya philosophies or darshanas that are based on the Vedas. And the Ashtikya means those that are theistic, have God at the center, and that follow and accept the Vedas as authority. And therefore, Karma Mimamsa, which is a very essential and integral part of Vedic philosophies, had to be included in the Bhagavad Gita by Krishna, Lord Krishna. So Lord Krishna speaks about Deva Yajna, which I also pointed out is mentioned in Manusmriti as one of the Panchamahayagyas. Having said all this, Krishna points out that after the performance of sacrifice, of Vedic sacrifice, when one is purified, there is no more need to work. But even as there is no more need to work, naiva tasya kritenartho na akritenaha kaschana. Krishna says there is no need not to work. And Krishna points out that even though you are already purified, or you believe or imagine that you are already purified, you must continue to work, just like King Janaka did. And King Janaka, through the performance of his work and Vedic fire sacrifice, eventually attained perfection. And even having attained perfection, he continued to function in the world identically to whatever he did pre-realization, because he wanted to act for the welfare of society and also set an example to other people who would see him as a leader and try to follow in his footsteps. So this is where we concluded last time. And having done that, Krishna then answers Arjuna's questions on what it is that prevents us from moving on this path towards self-realization. So, in fact, Krishna says in verse 31 that one who follows Krishna's instructions and these teachings faithfully becomes free from the bondage of repeated cycles of birth and death and fruitive action, which Krishna has already condemned. He wants you to do the sacrifices, but he wants you to do them without seeking fruit. Karmanyevadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. Ma karma phala hetur bhurmate sangosto akarmani. Having said that, now in chapter 3, that he said in chapter 2, in chapter 3, he points out that it's integral and important to do this and perform your sacrifice. In fact, he goes on to say that even if people are performing this fire sacrifice without knowledge, full of desire for the fruit, going to heaven, etc., etc., don't discourage them from working. Don't discourage them from the performance of sacrifice. And why not discourage them? Because he says they will be misled and they will abandon their work and they'll abandon the sacrifice. Instead, you teach them how to work in a spirit of devotion. So he says in text 26 of chapter 3, Na buddhi bhedam janayed ajnana karma sanginam joshet kasarva karmani vidvan yukt samacharan. The wise should not disrupt the minds of the ignorant who are attached to fruitive action. They should not be encouraged to refrain from work, but to engage in their work and sacrifice in the spirit of devotion. So, Krishna is very clear on this. He is totally against the abandonment of your God given duty. He is against the abandonment of your job, your profession, the purpose of your creation. And he guides Arjun that he must continue to fight as a Kshatriya does. And that is how he will attain deliverance. In fact, he tells him that don't try to give up your Kshatriya duties of fighting and do somebody else's duties, because that would be the height of foolishness. He points out in chapter 3, text 35, Shreyan swadharma viguna paradharmat svanushtitat swadharme nidhanam shreya paradharmo bhayavaha. It is far better to discharge your own duties, though they may be faulty, than to engage in someone else's duties. Because destruction or even death in the performance of your own duties is better than engaging in someone else's duties. For to follow another's path is very dangerous. So, having stressed the importance of doing duty and not abandoning your duty, but abandoning the desire for the fruit, finally, Krishna is asked by Arjun, what is it that causes us to commit sin? What is it that causes us to commit sin? Arjunivacha अथ केन प्रयुक्तोऽयं पापं चरति पुरुषः अनिच्छम् अपि वर्ष्णेय बलाद् इव नियोजितः. O descendant of Vrishni, Arjuna says, by what is one impelled to perform sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by an external force? And then Krishna gives the wonderful answer which all of us must remember. Krishna says to Arjuna in verse 37, very important verse, Shri Bhagwan Uvacha Kam Esha Krodha Esha Rajo Guno Samudbhavah Mahashano Mahapapma Vidya Enam Iha Vairanam. The blessed Lord said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born out of contact with the material modes of passion and later transformed into anger, which is the all-devouring sinful enemy in this world. So Krishna is pointing out that we are driven towards sinful acts because of our desire, our lust. By lust, he means many things. Any strong desire is a lust. You can have a lust for wealth, you can have a lust for power, you can have a lust for the opposite sex, you can have lust for some ideas or ideology which you espouse. So when you are having very strong desires, the world will frustrate them because that is the nature of the world. Because the world functions not according to your will, but the world functions according to Krishna's will, God's will. So when you are disturbed by that frustration, what happens? Then you get anger. This has already been described in the second chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna says, Dhyato Vishayan Pumsaha Sangaste Supajayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamaha Kamaha Krodha Vajayate Krodhat Bhavati Sammoha Sammoha Smriti Vibhrama Smriti Brahmashat Buddhi Nasho Buddhi Nashat Pranashyati. So Krishna explains how anger arises. When desire is frustrated, anger arises. And when your desire is fulfilled, greed arises. Because the frustration of your desire leads to anger, and the frustration of your desire and the fulfillment of your desire leads to desire for even more, and therefore greed arises. And Krishna says in the Bhagavad-Gita, Trividham narakasya idam dwaram nashanam atmanah kama krodha tatha lobhas tatsmad etatrayam tejet. Arjuna, there are three gates that lead to hell. Lust, that is strong desire. Anger, which comes when the desire is frustrated. And greed, lobh. So these three, if you can avoid, you could avoid the three gates to hell. This is pointed out by Krishna. So here he points out that lust, which is born, or strong desire, which is born out of misidentification with your Rajagun. See, Sattvagun, Rajagun, and Tamagun are all perfect in themselves. And they're perfect when they're left to God and surrendered to God. But when you believe that you are Prakriti and you try to struggle with your Prakriti, then you get into all kinds of problems. So, Rajagun is fine for activity in the world, but when you identify with Rajaguna, you think you are that Rajaguna, then you become filled with desire. And Krishna says that it is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this earth. In fact, he points out in the next verse, text 38 of chapter 3, Dhumenavritah vanir yatha darsho malena cha yatha olben avrito garbhas tatha tene dam avritam. So each person is covered by different degrees of this lust, depending upon the degree of purification a person has gone through not one, but many lifetimes. And what is that? If you are in Sattva Gun most of the time, you are not purely Sattva Gun. Because the gunas, all three are always present. And Krishna points out when we will do that chapter, that Sattva, Rajo, and Tamaguna are constantly battling with one another. But for one who has repeatedly and consistently purified himself across several lifetimes and across this lifetime, this desire, which is Rajagun, covers the soul just like a fire is covered by smoke. It's very easy when fire is covered by smoke. You can fan or you can blow and the smoke will go away and it'll get cleared up. So a person who's basically sattvic as a result of purification of activities in this and previous lives will find it easy to purify his desires, or purify himself and become free of desire by indeed blowing away the smoke that covers his fire. Or he says, the mirror is covered by dust. When Rajagun, Tamagun, and Sattvagun are constantly battling, and let's say Rajagun is more powerful, then the soul is covered by this Rajagun, or your awareness of the soul is covered by the Rajagun, just like the mirror is covered by dust. So if your mirror is covered by dust, you can't blow it away. You can take a wet cloth and you can wipe the mirror and it will become brilliant again. So also, even though Rajagun may be very prominent in your personality, if you are able to cleanse it with some effort, more effort than required to remove the smoke from the fire, just because it's easier to remove sattva to uncover this awareness of the soul. The Rajagun requires a little more effort, just like dust is covering the mirror. You can clean it. And then there is a person who is covered by Tamagun. The person who's covered by Tamagun is like the embryo or like the fetus, which is covered by the womb. And if any obstetricians are listening to this, they know how difficult it is to remove the baby or the fetus from the womb. If you do a cesarean section, you have to cut through many layers of the abdomen. You have to cut through many layers of the uterus. And finally, you have to extricate the fetus. Or the mother has to, if she's undergoing a normal delivery, has to undergo a lot of effort and discomfort to evacuate the baby from the womb. So also a person who is primarily filled, everyone has sattva gun, rajagun and tamagun. But if primarily your habits in this life and previous lives have been tamasic, it will take much more effort, just like it takes effort to remove the baby from the womb. And he says that thus a person's pure consciousness is covered by his eternal enemy in the form of strong desire or lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Now, in text 40 of chapter 3, Krishna explains where the strong desire arises. And these strong desires, Krishna points out, are situated in the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. Indriyani manobuddhir asyadhishtanam uchyate eter esha jnanam avritya dehinam. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this strong desire or lust, which veils the real knowledge of the living being and which bewilders him. Therefore, O Arjuna, O best of Bharatas, tasmatvam indriyani adau niyamya bharatarshava papamam papamanam prajahi enam jnana vijnana nashanam. Thus, regulate your senses. And thus, by regulating your senses, by curbing your senses, by restraining your senses, slay this destroyer of knowledge and realization. In the Kathopanishad, from which Krishna draws this, it's clearly said, Atmanam rathinam vidhi shariram ratham evatu buddhim tu saradham vidhi manah pragraham evacha indriyani parani ahur vishayamsteshu gocharan. So in the Kathopanishad, it directly says that the body, the soul, is riding on the chariot of the body. The body is the chariot of the soul. Intelligence is the charioteer. The mind are the reins, and the horses are the senses. One whose intelligence is divinely guided, one whose mind or reins are restrained, one whose senses are controlled and well directed, such a person goes tad Vishnu paramam padam. So if your intelligence is divinely guided, if your mind is restrained, or the senses are restrained, the mind is restrained through the reins, and the senses are controlled, Krishna explains that you will go on the path to attaining union with divinity. Then this verse is very similar to the one contained in Kathopanishad. Indriyani paranyahur vishayansteshu gocharan, Krishna says. And here he says, Indriyani paranyahur indriyebhyo pare manaha manasastu para buddhir yo buddhe paratastu saha. He says, when you keep your senses occupied, they will be superior to dull prakriti, which is attracting those senses. The mind is higher than the senses, and the intelligence is still higher than the mind. And the soul is even higher than the intelligence. So Krishna points out here in the Bhagavad-Gita, text 42 of chapter 3, one of the best ways to prevent your senses from carrying you away, because if the intelligence is not guided, the mind is not restrained, the senses are not controlled, the chariot is carried towards Narak, towards hell. So Krishna guides you and tells you that you must keep your senses occupied. How do you keep your senses occupied? By working in a spirit of devotion and renunciation. The more time you spend in doing task positive activities, this task positive network in your brain becomes activated. The default mode network in your brain becomes inactivated. You get peace of mind and you perform useful work within the world, adding value to people around you and to the environment. Because the senses, when they are working, Krishna says, is superior to the objects of the senses, which are simply dull matter. But your mind, if it is kept on God, is even higher than the senses. And your intelligence, guided by Krishna's message in the Bhagavad Gita, is even higher. And no doubt, the soul, which is your true identity, is even higher than intelligence. Evam buddhe param budva संस्तभ्यात्मनाम आत्मनः jahi shatru mahabhavo kama rupena durasadam. Understanding that you are not Prakriti, but that you are Purush, soul, and you are transcendental to the senses which are Prakriti, transcendental to the mind and intelligence which are Prakriti. You should control the lower Prakriti by focus on divinity, and thus through spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So this is Krishna's prescription, that understand that you are not this body, understand you are not this mind or intelligence either. Earlier in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna points out that very clearly. Krishna says that bhumi apo nalo vayur kham mano buddhireva cha ahankara ityam me bhinna prakriti ashtada. Earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and your false ego. All these are part of your inferior energies, my inferior energies. And he says, Aparayam itastvanyam prakritim vidhi me param jiva bhutam mahabhao yayedam daryate jagat. You are indeed superior to all the senses. You are indeed part of me, an infinitesimal part of me who is sustaining and maintaining creation. Now, it's important to understand that controlling the senses has been an integral part of Indian philosophy and Vedic philosophy. If you go to one of the earlier Upanishads, which is known as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Upanishad that comes from the great forest, the very second verse says, Mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha mokshayo, bandhaya vishaya saktam, muktye nirvishayam smritam. Your mind is the cause of bondage, and the mind is the cause of salvation. The mind, when it is bound and attached to the objects of the senses, is the cause of bondage. When your mind is attached and bound to the objects of the senses and the things of the world, you are in complete bondage. This mind is the cause of your bondage. But when your mind is free of thoughts of all these worldly objects, when your mind is free of all thoughts of the objects of the senses, then Krishna says, your mind becomes the cause of your salvation. Krishna has repeated this in the Bhagavad-Gita. He says that bandhur atmana atmanastasya yenatmaiva atmana jitah atmaiv tu shatrutve atmaiva yena tu shatruvat. So the mind can be the cause of your bondage, it can be your worst enemy or your best friend. That mind which is conquered is your best friend, and the mind which is not conquered is your worst enemy. Similarly, if you go to other more recent scriptures like, let's say, Ashtavakra Gita, Ashtavakra is talking to Janaka and he says, Muktim ichhasi chetatat Vishaya Vishesatvaja Kshama Javadayatos Asatvam Piyush Isavad Bhaja. If you are looking for salvation, my son, shun the objects of the senses like poison. So the desire to avoid the objects of the senses is present in all scriptures, from the most recent in Ashtavakra to the most ancient in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So therefore, it's so important for us to know what should we do. One is, of course, Krishna gives the answer, that work. As long as you are working and continuing to do activities within the world, you will find that your desires of this for these things or the things of this world will automatically be dampened, they will be attenuated, they will be weakened. The more you absorb yourself in doing work in a spirit of devotion and renunciation without seeking the fruits of your labor, you will find peace. But also, in advanced levels of bhakti, the 11th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, gives a unique method for those who are beginning in spiritual life and who have difficulty in controlling the objects of the senses. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, 6.46, in the Bhagavad-Geeta, Uddhava is speaking and he says, speaking to the Lord, he says, Tvai upabhukta shraga gandha vasho alankar charchita uchishta bhojino dasas tava mayam jayemahi. See, everyone is talking about in those days wanted garlands, fragrant oils, clothes, ornaments, delicious foods. And all these things, while enjoying them, they forgot about God. And the objects of the senses are not bad in themselves. But the objects of the senses are bad when they make you forget God. Because the message is always remember God and forget yourself. So when you are constantly absorbed in enjoyment of things of the world, you will automatically forget God. Therefore, in the Bhagavad-Geeta, Uddhava gives a unique solution. He says, if he first offer to you the garland, the perfume, the clothes, the ornaments, or jewelry, and having placed it on you, having given delicious food offered to you as prasad, we take that prasad which we have offered to you, and now when we enjoy these objects of the senses, they are no longer objects of the senses, they are prasad, and we don't forget you when we enjoy them. We remember you because it is prasad. And thus, we transcend your illusory energy or maya. How wonderful, how beautiful. So you have two methods by which you can conquer. One method is, of course, keep yourself occupied by working, adding value to the world. And the more you occupy yourself in the world in a spirit of sacrifice and devotion, remembering God and forgetting self, the more your senses will get under control. And thus strong desires will not sway you. And you will be free gradually from lust, anger, and greed. On the other hand, there are certain legitimate sense gratifications that are there. And these legitimate sense gratifications that are there, if you offer them to God and having God make them into a sacrament, a prasad, we then take these objects of enjoyment, we enjoy delicious prasad, we wear good clothes, we wear garments, we wear jewelry, we wear perfumes, all of which have been offered to God. We remember God because we have offered all these things to Him. And thus, we are protected from being poisoned by the objects of the senses. See, the objects of the senses are called Vishaya. Vishaya means wish, poison. But even the poisonous snakes are worn by a Mahadev around his neck. They are defanged, they are free of poison. So also when we offer the objects of the senses to God, in a spirit of devotion and renunciation, we make them into a sacrament. and then we utilize them or use them. We may enjoy them, but because indeed they remind us of God, they are no longer poisonous. So Krishna points out, keep yourself occupied without any sense of doership, in a spirit of devotion and renunciation. And not only will you thus conquer your mind and your intelligence by keeping your senses occupied in the service of God, by remembering Him and forgetting yourself, but when it does come time to have legitimate sense gratifications, and you need to have them, then you can offer them to God, make them into a sacrament, so that when you enjoy them, you remember God. Because the key is, the sin is to forget God through the enjoyment of the senses. And the medicine for that is to remember God. And thus, the objects of the senses, when they are offered to God, they help you to remember Him when you take it as prasad. With this, I will pause here because anyway, the third chapter comes to a conclusion. If you have anything to say, ask, discuss, share, please go ahead.
Thank you for the lovely session, Shantanu. It was quite enlightening and very thoughtful, something to ponder over for everyone. So my first question for today is that do you think modern distractions like technology and social media they make it more challenging for people to control their senses? And if we apply Gita's teachings to this particular scenario, to this context, so how can one control their senses and still focus more on their duty and work?
See, you know, I'm not against alternate electronic media, nor am I against social media. I just say that they should be used to remember God and not forget Him. So there are many social groups, WhatsApp groups, Facebook. In fact, we are on Facebook. So the idea is that we can use all these things to remember God and to come closer to Him. The problem is not with the world, the problem is the use of the world. And when the world is used to forget God, that's a problem. But when we use the things of the world to remember God, of course, it becomes a blessing.
Um, following up with Following this up with another question. So Krishna advises Arjun to act with wisdom and detachment. He also talks about balance in our life. So how can one achieve this while still engaging with the sensory world?
Please repeat your question.
I'm saying Krishna advises Arjun to act with wisdom and detachment in the Gita. Krishna also talks about maintaining a balance in life. So how
See, the
can one?
first thing is that, people think, oh, this is all about detachment. Never think that this is about detachment. It is about attachment to God. So we are not telling you to become detached from the world, we are asking you to become attached to God. And you will find that as you become attached to God, you will spontaneously, naturally, effortlessly become detached from the world. Vasudeva Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Projita Janayate Vairagyam Jnanam Choyadai Dukam. If you are engaged in worshipping God in the right manner, then both detachment as well as spiritual knowledge will spontaneously be yours. So don't focus on detachment and wisdom. You focus on attachment to God, and wisdom and detachment will follow in that wake.
Right. Thank you so much for today's engaging session, Shantnuji. And for all our viewers, do stay in touch with us and do connect with us next Thursday at 8 a.m. as we have yet another session on the Bhagavad Gita by Shantanu ji.
So Hari Om, Jai Shri Krishna, Hare Krishna.